Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the system shaping our world.
And today, we're actually taking a slightly different approach for this deep dive.
Yeah, we are, because usually when you pick up an autobiography, you're looking for a very specific kind of story.
Right. You want the narrative arc, you want to know about their childhood, their loves, their losses.
You want the great person theory. Like, look how this one unique individual overcame these massive odds to just completely change history.
It's a satisfying way to look at the world. But today, we are looking at a text that just explicitly rejects that entire framework.
Completely.
We are diving into Angela Davis, an autobiography. And I want to be really clear about our object of analysis here. We aren't just doing a biography of Angela Davis today.
No, we're treating this text as a map, like a topographical map of a very specific system.
Exactly. So if the book is the map, the territory we are navigating is the racialized carceral state operating within the framework of racial capitalism.
Which is, that is quite a mouthful to start us off with.
It is.
Can we maybe unpack that term a bit before we even open the book? Just racialized carceral state within racial capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely. So think of it this way. Most people look at a prison or a police force or a segregated neighborhood and they see separate things.
Right. They see racism over here and maybe law enforcement over there.
Exactly. But Davis is arguing that these aren't separate things at all. They are interconnected gears in a single machine. So capitalism is the engine, right?
Yeah.
It requires cheap labor and resource extraction to run.
Okay.
And racism is the fuel. Or maybe a better way to put it is the lubricant. It justifies the exploitation of certain groups of people to keep that engine profitable.
And so the carceral state, the prisons, the police, the courts, that's the mechanism that actually manages the people who get chewed up by that engine.
Precisely. So when you read this book, you aren't just reading about Angela Davis getting arrested. You're reading a structural blueprint.
A blueprint of how that machine identifies a threat, how it hunts it down, and how it tries to hide what it's actually doing.
Right. And Davis is very intentional about this. The material we're looking at covers her original 1974 text, the 1988 edition, and the newer 2021 preface. And in that preface, she actually admits she was really hesitant to write the book in the first place.
Which kind of surprised me, honestly. She was a massive global icon, the afro, the fist in the air. You'd think a book deal would be the very first thing she'd jump at.
Oh, the book deals were definitely there. But she was deeply suspicious of the underlying individualism of the autobiography genre.
She didn't want to play into that great woman narrative we talked about.
Exactly. She didn't want to contribute to the idea that history is made by special, unique individuals. She viewed this project as a collective biography.
So she's using her specific life experiences as a lens.
Yes, a lens to expose the machinery of state repression that millions of other people were caught in, but who just didn't have the global platform to describe it.
So when she describes sitting in a jail cell, she isn't saying, look at how much I suffered.
No, she's saying, look at how this cell is structurally designed to break a human being.
Right. And that distinction brings us to a concept we're going to be hammering on a lot today. The crisis in perception.
Yes, the core theme.
Because a crisis in perception is essentially the error of seeing systemic outcomes as individual tragedies. It's like looking at a massive traffic jam and just getting mad at the individual drivers.
Instead of looking at the city planning that designed the bottleneck in the first place.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So today, we're going to look at the city planning of oppression. And to do that, we actually have to go back to the beginning. We have to go to Birmingham, Alabama, in the 1940s.
We have to go to Dynamite Hill.
Dynamite Hill. just pause on that name for a second. That is not a metaphor.
No, that was the literal nickname of her childhood neighborhood.
It sounds like a location in a dystopian sci-fi novel.
It really does. But it was the daily reality of her childhood.
Davis grew up in Birmingham when it was arguably the most rigidly segregated city in America. And Dynamite Hill wasn't just a scary local legend. It was a description of real estate zoning enforcement. Walk us through the geography of that, because when you learn about segregation in school, it's usually presented in a very abstract way. Just blacks lived here, whites lived there.
But Davis describes it as an active war zone. It was a geographic conflict. There was this specific dividing line called Center Street.
Okay.
On the west side of Center Street, you had the white zone, large houses, grassy lawns, very suburban. On the east side, you had the black zone. And Davis's family moved into a house right on that border.
They were quite literally on the front line.
They were, and the response from the white side of the border wasn't, zoning petitions or angry letters to the editor. It was bombs.
Actual dynamite.
Actual dynamite. Davis writes so vividly about the soundscape of her childhood. She says the explosions were louder than thunder.
She talks about the physical sensation of it.
Yeah, the house shaking in the middle of the night, medicine bottles rattling off the shelves in the bathroom. She describes her father having to keep guns in his drawer and physically check the perimeter of the house before they could go to sleep.
Just imagine being 7 or 8 years old, lying in bed in the dark, just listening for the sound of dynamite. I mean, that fundamentally wires your brain a certain way.
It creates a highly specific worldview, absolutely. But here is where we need to apply our systems analysis. We have to ask, why were they bombing the houses?
Well, the standard surface-level answer is hate. They were racists who hated black people moving into their area.
And that is the individual answer. That is the surface level perception, the idea that bad people just do bad things. But if we look at the structure, what is the underlying incentive?
It usually comes down to money, so property value.
Exactly. The color line wasn't just about social preference or even just biological bigotry. It was about economic value. The white homeowners believed because the real estate system explicitly told them so that if black families moved in, their property values would instantly collapse.
So the bombings were an enforcement mechanism.
Yes, they were the enforcement mechanism of the segregationist housing market. It was a terrifyingly rational economic act within a racist system.
This system essentially pits these groups against each other. It tells the white homeowners, your wealth is entirely dependent on keeping those people out. And the logical outcome of that design is dynamite.
And this environment created the first major crisis in perception for the young Angela Davis. She writes really honestly about her confusion as a child. She naturally and instinctively hated the white people on the other side of the hill.
Which is a pretty logical connection to make when you're a kid. White person equals bomb.
It is completely logical, but her mother intervened, and this is a really fascinating part of her cognitive development. Her mother was an activist. She'd been involved in the campaign to free the Scottsboro Boys, and she had worked with white communists.
So she had a broader framework.
Right. And she tried to teach Angela this very difficult nuance. There's this incredible story about the phone ringing in their house.
Oh, the phone call. Yes.
The phone rings, Angela answers it, and it's a white woman on the line. And Angela describes this visceral bodily reaction. She hears the white voice, and she just feels pure anger.
She wanted to hang up on her.
She wanted to scream. Because in her mind, that white voice is the same thing as an explosion.
But her mother takes the phone.
Her mother takes the receiver, speaks very politely, handles whatever the business was, and afterwards, she sits Angela down and explains that the white lady on the phone is not the same as the men planting the bombs.
She was trying to teach her daughter to separate the individual from the structure.
Exactly. And that is a really heavy lesson for a kid.
Yeah, like, don't hate the people who are benefiting from your oppression.
Well, it wasn't even about not hating. It was about targeting your hate correctly. Her mother insisted that white hatred was not a natural phenomenon. She argued that the violence wasn't some biological imperative of having white skin.
It was a structural requirement of the Southern economic order.
Yes. If you see the violence as just biological hate, you think the core problem is people. But if you see it as a structural requirement, you realize the problem is the system.
But Davis admits in the book that she didn't fully grasp that at the time.
Right? No, she was confused. She writes that she saw the guns. She saw the weeping women arriving at their door whose houses had just been blown to pieces. The emotional reality of the terror was just too strong to intellectualize.
But that seed was planted. The idea that things are not exactly as they appear on the surface.
Exactly. So she has this immense external pressure from the bombings. But then she also talks about the internal pressure, the pressure inside the Black community itself. She goes to Parker High School, and she describes something she calls the Booker T. Washington syndrome.
This is critical because this is how the system maintains itself even when it's not actively using bombs.
Right. The narrative given to these Black students at Parker High was basically the classic American meritocracy myth. Work hard, be respectable, pull up your socks. If you are excellent, the system will eventually reward you.
But these kids aren't stupid. They look outside the school windows, they see their parents working incredibly hard, doing all the right things, and getting nowhere.
They see that they still can't vote.
They see that no matter how hard they study their textbooks, they can still get blown up in their beds on Dynamite Hill.
So the narrative of working hard collided violently with the structural reality, which was that the system is designed to absorb Black labor without ever granting political power.
And when those two things collide, it creates friction. Immense psychological friction.
And where does that friction go?
It turns into violence. But not violence against the state?
No. Inner-directed violence. Davis describes Parker High School as a whirlpool of violence. She talks about the fights, the knifings, the fratricide.
Students just turning on each other.
It's tragic to read. You have a community under siege, and instead of uniting against the siege, the kids are fighting each other in the hallways.
But from a systems perspective, that is a design feature. It's not a bug.
Exactly. If the oppressed population is fighting itself, if the violence is contained entirely within the Black community, it poses zero threat to the white power structure.
It keeps the population fragmented.
It takes all the energy that could be used for a political revolution and redirects it into pure self-destruction.
So Davis is living in this intense pressure cooker. She sees the external violence of the Klan, and she sees the internal violence of her classmates. And she knows something is deeply wrong with the American dream story she's being fed.
But she doesn't have the analytical words for it yet. She doesn't have the map.
So she has to leave to find it. She leaves the South. She goes up to Brandeis University in Massachusetts. Then she goes to France, and eventually she lands in Frankfurt, Germany.
And this brings us to part 2, the analytic layer. This is the part of her life that I think really surprises people who only know the poster image of her.
Right. We think of her as this quintessential American activist, but her intellectual foundation is deeply German.
She goes to study philosophy with the absolute giants of the Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer. She immerses herself in Marxism, critical theory, Kant.
And she describes this specific period as the moment the cataracts fell from her eyes.
Cataracts, meaning she felt she was partially blind before, or at least her vision was heavily clouded by the American narrative.
What did studying dense, abstract German philosophy actually do for a Black woman from Birmingham? On the surface, it seems like two totally disconnected worlds.
That's the brilliance of it. The philosophy gave her the theoretical tools to connect those worlds. Before, she saw racism, and she saw poverty, and she saw violence as these separate bad things. Critical theory taught her to see the hidden connections.
She began to see the dialectical relationship between things.
Exactly. She connected the hidden guns of Birmingham to the profit motive of capitalism.
Okay, let's slow down and really map that out for the listener, because that's the core of the whole book. How does a bomb on Dynamite Hill fuel capitalism?
Think about labor. Capitalism is an economic engine driven by the need to constantly maximize profit. And to maximize profit, you have to minimize the cost of labor.
So you need cheap labor.
Right. And how do you guarantee a massive pool of cheap labor? You need a specific group of people who are desperate, disenfranchised, and have literally no other options. Racism is the tool that creates that group.
By segregating Black people, by denying them decent education and voting rights, the system creates a permanent underclass that has no choice but to take the worst jobs for the lowest pay.
And the bombs, the terror, that violence is the discipline. It's the fence around the cheap labor pool.
So if they try to move out, if they try to climb the economic ladder by moving to Dynamite Hill,
you bomb them back into their zone. You bomb them back into their economic function.
wow. So the weeping woman in her childhood door, she wasn't just the victim of a hateful neighbor. She was a casualty of a massive economic system that actively needed her to be terrified so it could remain profitable.
Yes, Davis actually writes, profit was the word. That was her great epiphany. The system keeps itself alive by actively encouraging competition and hatred between the white working class and the Black working class.
Because if those two groups ever united, they could challenge the people who actually own the capital.
Exactly. But if the white workers are taught to hate the Black workers, if they are taught that their whiteness is a form of property that they have to defend with dynamite, then the working class stays divided.
And that brings us right back to the crisis in perception. The white bombers honestly thought they were defending their neighborhood. But in reality, they were defending the very system that exploited them too, just in a different way.
Precisely. She realizes that the emancipation of the proletariat, the working class, is the necessary foundation for the emancipation of all oppressed groups. It is a nested system.
You have the economic system of capitalism wrapping around and utilizing the social system of racism.
And once she sees this, once the cataracts are gone, she cannot unsee it. So she returns to the United States in the late 60s, not just as an academic philosopher, but as an activist armed with a structural map.
And she lands a job teaching philosophy at UCLA. The civil rights movement is transitioning into the Black Power movement.
And this is where we enter part 3, the state apparatus. We've mapped the cognitive layer from her childhood, the analytic layer from her education, and now we get to see the state's immune response.
Because the state detects a threat in her.
Almost immediately. She's a brilliant, popular teacher. Her students are flocking to her lectures, but she is an open member of the Communist Party. And in 1969, the state of California is run by Governor Ronald Reagan.
And Reagan and the Board of Regents move to fire her.
They do.
Now, I want to play devil's advocate here just for a second to understand the context. It's 1969. The Cold War is very hot. The Soviet Union is the stated enemy of the nation. If you are the governor and you have an avowed communist teaching philosophy to impressionable kids at a state-funded university, isn't that a legitimate security concern from their perspective?
If you accept the state's narrative framework, yes, it makes total sense. If you believe the official narrative that communism equals Soviet spy equals enemy of the state, then their actions seem rational.
But Davey argues that the label communist was actually being used as a proxy.
Yeah. A proxy for black radicalism, a proxy for systemic critique. The state couldn't fire her for being black, and they couldn't legally fire her for being against racism because by 1969, that was becoming socially unacceptable to say out loud.
But they could fire her for being a red.
Exactly. They dug up an old, obscure 1949 statute to purge her from the university. The goal was to delegitimize her critique. By tagging her with the communist label, they were signaling to the public, she is not one of us, she is a foreign agent. Do not listen to her analysis of our systems.
It's effectively a way of stripping someone of their citizenship. You categorize them as an enemy combatant in the culture war.
But this tactic actually backfired in a really revealing way, and it leads to one of my absolute favorite anecdotes in the entire autobiography.
The supermarket scene.
Yes. So Davis is being vilified in the press every single day. Reagan is attacking her on television. She's getting constant death threats. She feels incredibly isolated and paranoid.
And she just goes to the grocery store to get food.
Right. She's in the supermarket aisle, probably looking over her shoulder, feeling the weight of the whole state on her. And she bumps into a middle-aged black woman.
And Davis freezes. She thinks, oh no, here it comes. The propaganda works. She's going to scream at me.
But the woman stops, looks at her closely, and says, "Are you Angela Davis?" Davis just nods, basically bracing for the blow. And the woman reaches out and hugs her.
Just right there in the grocery aisle.
Right there. She hugs her and says, "Keep fighting."
I just love that moment so much. It's such a human interaction.
It is deeply human, but it's also vital structural evidence. It perfectly illustrates the gap between the state narrative and the community reality.
The state was broadcasting communist threat, danger, enemy.
But the community looked at her and saw black women fighting for us. The state's manufactured crisis in perception just didn't work on everyone. The label didn't stick the way Reagan intended.
But the state doesn't just give up because one lady in a supermarket wasn't convinced. When the administrative firing doesn't silence her, they escalate. And the story gets very dark, very fast.
Yes. We have the shootout at the Marin County Civic Center. Jonathan Jackson, who is the heavily armed younger brother of George Jackson, takes hostages in a courtroom to demand the release of the Soledad brothers.
And it ends in a massive police shootout. 4 people die, including the judge and Jonathan Jackson.
Now, Davis was not there. She wasn't in the rented van. She wasn't in the courtroom.
She was nowhere near the building.
No. But the guns Jonathan Jackson used were legally registered in her name.
And that is the mechanical link the state needed.
That was the hook. They charged her with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. And this triggers the next massive phase of the state apparatus, the hunt. She becomes the 3rd woman in history to be placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list.
And the media just goes into absolute overdrive. The image they created of her during this time is wild. The Angela Davis icon, the huge afro, the stern militant look.
This is the narrative feedback loop in action. The FBI puts her on the most wanted list, which tells the media she is extremely dangerous. The media then broadcasts this armed and dangerous terrorist profile nationwide.
Which shifts public perception.
Which then justifies the state using extreme militarized force to capture her. It's a completely self-validating cycle. They essentially created a monster to justify deploying their monster hunting machine.
So she goes underground, she's on the run for months, wearing disguises, moving from safe house to safe house across the country. It reads like a Hollywood spy thriller.
It does, but again, Davis doesn't want us looking at the thriller elements. She wants us looking at the system, so we have to look closely at the capture. She is eventually tracked down and cornered at a Howard Johnson motel in New York City.
The FBI rushes the room. They have her. She's unarmed. She's not resisting. But describe how she frames that specific scene.
It is structurally chilling. The agents surround her in the room, and they ask her a question. They say, "Are you Angela Davis?"
And she doesn't answer them at first.
So they ask again, "Are you Angela Davis?" And they just keep repeating it. "Are you Angela Davis?"
Which is so bizarre because they had her mugshot. They had been hunting her for months. They obviously knew exactly who she was. So why the repetition?
It is the state's bureaucratic need to identify and tag the anomaly. The system cannot tolerate ambiguity. To the state, a person without a name is just a body. But Angela Davis is a file. She is a case number. She is a target.
They needed her to verbally confirm her own placement into their system.
Yes, it's an act of bureaucratic possession. The moment she finally says, "I am Angela Davis," she ceases to be a free human being and officially becomes a process unit of the carceral state.
And that leads us directly into the belly of the beast.
Yeah.
She is taken to the Women's House of Detention in New York and later transferred to the Marin County Jail in California. And this is where the text pivots. It stops being a political thriller and becomes a granular, almost architectural analysis of prison.
Right. This is part 4, the carceral state. And I think we should warn you, this is the heavy stuff. This isn't just a generic jail is a bad place narrative. It's a detailed breakdown of how jail is designed to function.
Because she states the goal of the system very clearly. She says the design goal isn't rehabilitation. It isn't even public safety.
No, she writes that the specific design goal is to break human beings, to systematically convert them into specimens in a zoo.
But how does the system actually do that? Because it's not just about locking a door, right? I can lock my front door at home and I don't feel like a zoo specimen. What is the actual mechanism of dehumanization?
She identifies it as the deprivation model. It's the intentional weaponization of basic human needs. Let's look at the commissary system she describes. To an outside observer, a commissary just looks like a little convenience store where prisoners can buy snacks or soap or toothpaste.
Right, it looks like a perk, a privilege to make time easier.
But Davis identifies it as a core control mechanism. Think about it. In the free world, if you are hungry, you get food. If your teeth feel dirty, you brush them. In jail, the state inserts itself between your biological need and your fulfillment of that need.
They make the fulfillment conditional.
Exactly. The unspoken rule is if you conduct yourself in such a way as to provoke an officer, or if you don't show the proper deference, you lose your commissary privileges.
So suddenly, toothpaste isn't a basic hygiene right. It's a behavioral reward for compliance.
It infantilizes the adult prisoner. It forces you to participate in your own subjugation because every single time you obey an arbitrary, humiliating order just to get a bar of soap, you are physically reinforcing the power dynamic. You are training your own brain to submit to the state.
And speaking of submission and dehumanization, we have to talk about the roach.
The roach in the breakfast tray.
This scene really stuck with me. It's so awful. She's in the Women's House of Detention. She gets her morning breakfast tray. She looks down into the grits or the oatmeal, and there's a dead cockroach right in the middle of it.
It's an incredibly visceral, disgusting image.
I mean, we all hear jokes about prison food being bad, but a cockroach, that's not just bad culinary standards, that's psychological warfare.
It is. And it serves a vital systemic function. It signals to the prisoner, you are trash. You are not worth clean food. You are completely indistinguishable from the vermin in this building.
It is a direct assault on self-worth.
Yes. Because if you can make a person truly believe they are garbage, they are significantly less likely to fight back. They are less likely to organize with other prisoners.
But while she is experiencing this grim reality on the inside, the roaches, the freezing cells, the conditional toothpaste, what is the world on the outside hearing about her conditions? Because the national news was reporting on her status every day.
This is the media distortion at work. This is the crisis in perception playing out in real time on national television. The lead prosecutor, a man named Albert Harris, tells the press that Angela Davis is being treated like absolute royalty.
He actually claims she is living in a 2-room suite with a private color television.
A 2-room suite in a county jail.
It sounds like a hotel booking.
But the reality, as Davis meticulously details, was a tiny 6-by-8-foot concrete cell, and the second room of this supposed suite was an adjacent padded cell.
It's a psychiatric punishment cell.
Yes, where the toilet was completely broken and regularly backed up, flooding her floor with liquid excrement.
And the private television.
It was only private because she was locked in solitary confinement. The general prison population had a shared TV in the common area. Because the state isolated her, they gave her a small TV so she wouldn't completely lose her mind, which is actually standard procedure to prevent complete sensory deprivation. But the prosecutor spun it to the press as a luxury perk.
Why bother lying about that, though? Why invent the two-room suite story when the press could eventually find out the truth?
The structural goal is to strip the prisoner of all public sympathy. Think about the public psychology here. If the average citizen thinks the prisoner is suffering, eating roaches, smelling sewage all day, they might actually feel empathy.
They might start questioning the morality of the state's actions.
But if they think she's living in a luxury suite,
They feel resentment. They think, why is this accused murderer getting a suite and a colored TV when I'm working 40 hours a week just to pay my rent?
exactly, it creates a wedge. It completely neutralizes any moral argument against the conditions of her confinement. It's a highly calculated manipulation of public perception designed to maintain support for the carceral state.
It's so cynical. They weaponize the public's own economic anxiety and point it directly at the prisoner.
It is deeply cynical and it is brutally effective. But, and this is where we see the incredible resilience of the human spirit, even within this crushing, isolating architecture, Davis observes something amazing happening. She observes a counter-system emerging.
The prisoner subculture.
Yes, the family structure. She enters the general population eventually, and she finds that the women, despite being stripped of literally everything, have organically organized themselves into alternative families.
You had prisoners acting as mothers, daughters, husbands, wives.
Now, at first, she's actually confused by it. You have to remember, she's this highly educated intellectual Marxist. She looks at these women playing house, and she initially dismisses it as mere escapism.
But then she applies her systems analysis to it.
And she realizes it's a profound survival mechanism. It is a human system emerging within an inhuman architecture.
The state tries to reduce you to a number. The state tries to sever all your social bonds so you are weak and isolated.
And the prisoners intuitively respond by making themselves kin. It is a collective defense mechanism against social death.
And they didn't just play house to survive emotionally, they used collective action practically. This brings up one of the most brilliant examples of system hacking in the whole book, the bail fund.
The bail fund is absolute genius. Davis realizes that many of the women in the detention center are stuck in jail simply because they can't afford $50 for bail.
$50. That was the literal price of their freedom. Because they don't have it, they sit in a cell and lose their outside jobs, they lose their apartments, they lose custody of their kids.
So the global movement outside starts raising massive amounts of money for Angela's defense. But Davis and the other prisoners realize that if they just use that money to pay the bail for random women, it's just charity.
It fixes the individual's immediate problem, but it leaves the systemic problem completely untouched.
Right. So they decide to turn the bail fund into an organizing tool.
They set up a system where the prisoners inside actually vote on who gets bailed out next.
Imagine the empowerment of that.
Yeah.
A democratic, collective decision-making process running inside a cage. And they attach condition to the money. If you get bailed out by the fund, you don't just get to walk away and forget about everyone else.
You have to work for the fund on the outside. You have to join the movement.
It is brilliant. You take a tool of state oppression, the cash bail system, and you flip the incentive structure. You use it to recruit and train activists.
It transforms the prisoner from a passive recipient of aid into an active agent of political change.
And it bridges that solid wall between the inside and the outside. It proves that even in the most tightly controlled environment on Earth, you can hack the system if you organize collectively.
Which brings us to the ultimate arena where this inside-outside conflict plays out. The place where the state tries to finalize its judgment. The courtroom.
Part 5. The courtroom. And we have to spend a minute talking about the physical stage where this trial happens, because she wasn't tried in a dusty, dark old dungeon.
No, it was a literal architectural masterpiece.
Yeah.
The Marin County Civic Center, designed by none other than Frank Lloyd Wright.
It's a stunning building. Circular motifs everywhere, beautiful hidden lighting, gold spires reaching into the sky. And Davis writes that Wright's explicit intention for the design was to depict justice as a cooperative, non-adversarial pursuit.
He wanted the courtroom to feel like a circle, holding hands around a circle. That was the actual vibe he was going for, a community coming together as equals to solve a social problem.
It sounds incredibly lovely, doesn't it? Very utopian.
But Davis walks into this gorgeous room in chains, and she experiences a profound crisis in perception, because the architecture screams equality, but the structural reality screams trap.
She looks across the room at the judge, and the prosecutor. And she realizes they aren't holding hands with her. She writes, "There was absolutely nothing I had in common with the men sitting around the courtroom circle." She saw them for what they were, manipulators of a judicial game.
The circle was a lie. It was just an aesthetic mask covering up the brutal power dynamics of the state.
The physical architecture suggested that the defendant was an equal participant with a fair shot, when in reality, the entire apparatus, the laws, the police, the media, the judge, was perfectly aligned to crush her.
The design masks the function.
And that disconnect between the beautiful aesthetic of justice and the ugly reality of repression is exactly what makes the system so difficult to fight, because to the average voter, it looks fair.
So how do you fight a game that is rigged that well? You have to hack this system again. And this leads to a really fascinating internal debate among her supporters about the Free Angela bail campaign.
This is a critical nuance in the book that is almost always lost in the historical memory of the trial. Davis initially opposed her own bail campaign.
Which sounds crazy, right? Why would she oppose getting out of jail on bail? Who actually wants to stay in a cell with roaches and sewage?
But because she was a committed revolutionary, she felt that focusing the movement's energy on getting her bail was too liberal. It was a reformist demand.
She thought we should be demanding the complete abolition of the court system, not asking the court nicely for permission to let me out.
Exactly. She worried that participating in the bail process validated the legitimacy of a corrupt system.
But her core committee activists like Kendra Alexander and Franklin Alexander, they pushed back hard against her.
They did. They understood the systems level strategy better than she did in that moment.
Yeah.
They argued that the bail issue was the perfect wedge.
How so?
It allowed the movement to expose the rotten core of the judicial system, which is the blatant criminalization of poor people, in a way that the general masses could actually understand.
Right. Most people aren't ideologically ready to just burn down the prisons. But most people can easily understand that it is fundamentally unfair to keep a person in a cage for months simply because they haven't been convicted yet and can't afford to buy their way out.
Exactly. It brilliantly bridged the gap between radical abolition and liberal fairness. It gave regular people a tangible injustice to rally against, which created a massive global movement. And to her credit, Davis admits in the book that she was wrong and her committee was right.
The bail campaign worked. It didn't just get her out. It educated millions of people about the structural unfairness of the system.
So we have the media war, the jail war, the bail war, and finally we get to the trial itself. And there's a specific moment in the trial that I think perfectly encapsulates this massive clash of perceptions.
Oh, when the prosecutor starts reading her private letters?
The letters to George Jackson. This is the absolute climax of the cognitive struggle in the book.
The prosecutor gets his hands on these intimate letters. Davis wrote to George Jackson, who was a prisoner and a renowned revolutionary author himself. And the prosecutor reads them out loud to the jury, hoping to prove that she was just a woman in love who was driven by blind passion to buy guns for a prison breakout.
He is desperately looking for the classic crime of passion narrative. He wants to reduce her massive structural political actions to individual emotional volatility. She did it for love. It's a very old, very gendered trope.
But what is actually written in the letters?
She's writing deep analyses of economic determinism. She writes lines like, "Survival instincts perverted by a structure which coerces me to kick my jobless man out, so the social worker doesn't stop those welfare checks."
Wait, she's analyzing the structural flaws of the welfare state in a love letter.
Yes, because that is who she is. She is discussing how the administrative rules of welfare actively destroy Black families by forcing unemployed men to leave the home just so the mother can legally qualify for aid to feed her kids.
And the lead prosecutor of the state of California is standing there reading this out loud to the jury.
He's reading it and he physically falters. He stumbles over the words. He literally cannot compute the text he is reading. He is looking for, "I love you so much, let's kill the guards." And instead, he finds a dense academic dissertation on structural violence.
It's a real-time collision of two completely different languages. You have the language of the state, which only has the vocabulary to see individual guilt and individual emotion. And you have the language of the movement, which only sees massive structures and economic forces.
The court sees passion. The letters describe systemic coercion. And because the prosecutor couldn't understand her structural critique, his prize evidence completely backfired on him.
It didn't prove she was an emotional conspirator. It proved she was a serious political theorist.
Right. It showed the jury that her relationship with Jackson was primarily intellectual and political, not just some reckless romantic obsession.
And eventually, the jury sees through the state's case. She is acquitted of all charges. She walks out of that Frank Lloyd Wright building a free woman. The system let her go.
But did it? Or did the immense global collective pressure on the system force it to open a release valve to save its own legitimacy?
That's the real question. And the story doesn't end with her walking out the door. Most autobiographies end with the hero winning the big battle. I beat the charges, the end. But Davis adds this fascinating preface to the book almost 50 years later.
And this brings us to our final section, Part 6, Structural Clarity, the 2021 preface. In it, she draws a direct, unbroken line, a continuum. She explicitly connects the Free Angela movement of the early 1970s to the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020.
She mentions George Floyd. She mentions Breonna Taylor.
She points out how the struggle has evolved over the decades. In the 70s, they were primarily fighting to free specific political prisoners, to get individual activists out of the box. It was largely a defensive battle against state targeting.
But by 2021,
the framework had fundamentally shifted to targeting the prison industrial complex itself. The goal wasn't just to free the individual prisoner anymore, but to contest the very existence of the prison, to question the necessity of the carceral state as a solution to social problems.
she writes that the success of the 1970s movement paved the road for the abolitionist framework of the 21st century.
It's a nested system over time. The earlier struggle built the intellectual and organizational infrastructure that the current struggle relies on. She wants you to understand that freedom isn't a static state of being that you achieve once and keep forever.
It's a constant, ongoing struggle against the shifting incentive architecture of repression.
So let's bring this all back to our central theme, the crisis in perception. We've spent this deep dive breaking down her map of the territory. What is the explicit analysis we need to walk away with?
The crisis in perception in this case is the persistent tendency to view the story of Angela Davis as the triumph of a unique individual against bad luck or a few bad apples in the government.
We constantly misperceive the great person for the collective power.
Exactly. If you read this book and think Angela Davis fought the United States government alone and won, you are suffering from a crisis in perception. It was the collective power of thousands of organizers that actually forced the state to yield.
And what is the specific structural layer being obscured by that individualistic narrative?
The deeply entrenched connection between capitalism and prisons. We tend to stop our analysis at racism. We say, the justice system has racist outcomes, so we just need to put less racist people in charge of it.
But systems analysis goes much deeper than that. Systems analysis asks, what is the actual function of that racism? And Davis's entire life's work argues that racism is merely the tool used by capitalism to manage surplus populations and enforce social control.
Meaning, if you just swap out the racist individuals, but you keep the underlying capitalist incentives for cheap labor and social control, the prison system will continue to function exactly the same way.
If we rely on surface-level interpretation, we look at the end of this book and we see a heartwarming story about justice finally being served in a courtroom.
But if we use systems analysis, we see that the courtroom was designed as a trap, the jail was designed as a deprivation machine, and her freedom wasn't a fair verdict. It was the result of hacking the system through mass organization.
Systems analysis completely changes what becomes visible to us. It changes how we see the circle.
It transforms the beautiful courtroom circle from a symbol of cooperative justice into a symbol of encirclement and containment.
And it reveals that the dramatic events, the dynamite, the guns, the trial, the FGA manhunt are all just symptoms. The underlying structure is the disease.
And that structure, the racialized carceral state operating within racial capitalism, is exactly what Davis mapped for us in this book. Her life was just the topography she used to draw it. We just have to be willing to learn how to read the map.
I think that feels like the perfect place to leave it. A reminder that we need to look past the individual headlines and focus on the architectural blueprints.
Exactly.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shaped belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.